Last week we read these verses and we're going to reread them and then focus on, for the most part of the sermon, just the last two verses. We're going to get a little bit into the middle one, but for the most part, just 12 and 13. But for the whole reading, John 1, chapter 9, or verse 9, verses 13. John tells us this: the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Last week we focused on the first three verses, and for the most part, we're not going to spend a lot of time there, but I just want to remind us to set up this morning as we're really going to look at what does it mean to receive and to believe, and then that beautiful outcome of becoming children of God. But last week, verse 11, we spent a little bit of time on that. It's not on the screen, but just hear this again. John said this about Jesus. Now remember, John is writing this book from the perspective of watching this Jesus grow up and then spend 3 years in intense ministry. And so he was watching as an outsider his whole life unfold and take place. And so he's looking back, and as he looks back, he writes this in verse 11. He, referring to Jesus, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Last week I mentioned that, and it's important to remember this, that when John wrote those words, he was not specifically thinking of us sitting here today in Buford, Georgia, 2021. He had a very intentional audience in mind, which was the chosen nation of Israel that he was referring to. He, Jesus, came to his own people. He was one of them in the flesh, and his own people did not receive him. To highlight that fact, Jesus told a parable in the Gospel of Matthew, in the Gospel of Luke, where he told this parable about these wicked tenants. And I'm not going to read the parable to you, but I just want to remind you of it in case you have forgotten. But Jesus told this parable that there was a man who had rented out property from another man, and he had, at harvest time, had a full harvest. And so the owner of the property sent one of his servants to go get his rightful portion as payment of the harvest. And when the workers at the fields saw the tenant send, the owner send this the servant, they beat him and they sent him back on his way. And so the owner thought, well, that's really strange. I'll send another servant. So he sent a second one, and the second one experienced the same treatment. He was beaten and then sent back. And getting frustrated, the owner sent a third servant, probably someone a little bit bigger, a little bit taller, a little bit stronger, a little bit more persuasive with his words. I'm coming to get that which is my own. And a third time, they beat the servant, and they sent him back to the owner. And so the owner, confused and not understanding what's going on, that is mine. I own it. They're just renting it. I'm rented this to them for a price. They owe me as the owner. Maybe if they send my own son, my own flesh and blood, they'll recognize the severity and the tension that is being caused. They'll see my son, they'll honor him, and they'll give me my due portion. And so he sends the son, and how do they respond? They up the game. Instead of beating the son and sending him back, they see the son, they see this is the one who is the rightful heir to all of this. And because, to borrow the phrase I used earlier, he's not the boss of me, they murdered the son. And then they sent the body back of the son to the owner. And Jesus told that parable because he wanted his own people. He wanted you and I subsequently to hear this message that he has come, that he is pleading with us to become his children, that he has claim over us, and that we are often like the renters of the field where we beat the servant or we reject the son. Man in his natural fallen state and in his fallen proclivity will push back and fight against God. But then the text does this dramatic turn, and we see in verse 12 these words, yet, to all who did receive him, to those who did believe in his name, he gave them the right to become children of God. And so John does this thing because he also saw and witnessed in the ministry of Jesus that, yes, there were several people who rejected him, and the majority actually did, but yet there were some who did receive him. And so my question would be this to you. What is it about Jesus that makes him so irresistible that tax collectors and prostitutes want to follow him and want to be near him? Why is it that it's typically the broken, the downtrodden, and not the religious people who long to receive Jesus and to believe in him and to say, I am yours, you are mine, do with me what you want? What makes people far from God want to be near him? Let me ask that again. What makes people who are seemingly far from God want to be near him? Let me bring it home just a little bit more and hang the mirror in front of us. What makes Jesus so irresistible to you? What makes Jesus so resistible to you? To all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become the children of God. So long ago, there was this rancher who owned several thousand cattle that he had out on several 100,000 acres of land. And one day, a good friend of his, a neighbor, was noticing he doesn't have any fences up around his property. His thousands of cattle are allowed to just roam freely wherever they want. Why is he doing this? And at some point over breakfast, he couldn't handle not knowing the answer to that. And so he asked him, I'm dying to know, how is it that you have millions of dollars invested in these thousands of cattle, and yet you don't have a fence for them? How do you know they're not going to just wander off? And the old man said, that's easy. When we decide where we want them to graze, we dig a well of water. And when they realize that if they stray too far, they have no water, they will wander back because they cannot resist the water. They need it. They intuitively know that if they don't have that, if they don't stay near it, their life is at danger. So therefore, there's no need to put a fence around them. And so again, as we consider this verse 12 and verse 13 this morning, and we just pause and we look at what does it mean to really receive and to believe in Jesus? It's because Jesus is the well of water. And at some point, if you have received and if you have believed, you have come to a place where you recognize, because of God's Spirit working in you and changing you, you have come to a place where you recognize there's life in that well. And if I leave it, I'm gonna die. If I leave it, I'm going to struggle more than I have to. But there's also, chances are in this room, a few, maybe one, maybe 10, who knows? Only God. But there's somebody sitting here this morning where you're still looking at this well of water and you're the one cow, the one cattle who's saying, You're not the boss of me. I don't need that, and I'm going to do what I want. And Jesus has come, and he has invited you. And his grace is massaging your heart, and it's softening it. And for a moment, maybe for years, you have been or you still are in this place of not yet. What does it mean to receive? That's the word that Jesus says, or that John says here, to those who received him. And if you remember, and you probably don't, and that's okay, last week I defined this word, and I just want to remind you what I said. When they would have heard that word received, in their language, they would have understood that, and their language was spoken in such a way that it painted mental pictures. It gave them imageries with their words. So when they heard the word receive, they would have heard to take into possession. To receive something means to have it. It's now mine. I'm the owner. To receive means to appropriate. I mean, it's not just there. I'm putting it to use over here. It's to receive this gift, what it means to appropriate. If you have been given a brand new car for Christmas, and if you have, I'd love to talk to you about our current financial situation. But if you have received a brand new car for Christmas, and then you choose, I'm not worthy to receive that gift, or I don't like the color of that, or I can't drive a stick shift, or whatever reason, until you get in and you start using the car, you haven't appropriated it. You've received it, but you haven't taken ownership. You have not made that your own. Years ago, when I was on staff with FCA, and I was actually meeting with a basketball coach, and I may have shared this before, but I was meeting with a basketball coach at the local high school who had just experienced an unbelievable trauma just a couple months earlier, in that one of his basketball players, while they were doing a workout, the kid fell over and collapsed and died. And as the coach, he spent a half an hour, or probably less, 15 minutes, he spent half an hour performing CPR. He climbed into the ambulance and rode with them to the hospital where he died on the table. This guy was a wreck. And I happened to one day walk into his office and say, hey, do you have time to chat? And he just hung his head and his eyes filled up in tears. I hadn't talked with him in over a month. And he said, I'm so glad you're here. My heart is so broken. I need help. Please help me. Well, hallelujah. And so I asked him, would you mind reading through a book with me? And the book was by Tim Keller, and it was called The Prodigal God, which I love. And it paints this picture of these two different sons. And he kept saying to me for weeks as we went through this book, I'm the older brother, I'm the older brother, I'm the older brother. And at some point I said to him, because I felt the Spirit was moving in some level, and I said, Alan, are you at a place where you believe that God is calling you to himself, and that you need to repent, and that you need to place your trust in this Christ, that you need to receive the gift he's offered? And he responded by saying, can't do it, man. Can't do it. I said, Alan, I'm curious to know why. And forgive me for saying this, but he replied, that scares the hell out of me. I can't do it. I love Jesus, but what you're talking about is more than I'm willing to pay. And then the next words out of his mouth were, but you know I'm a Christian, right? I said, oh, Alan, we've got a lot more to talk about. If you're here sitting this morning, I just want to ask you the question. Have you taken into possession? Have you received? Have you bent the knee to this Jesus and said, what you have, I want? You know, there's this another parable that Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 13, where he's going through this parable of this farmer who's throwing out seed, and he offers 4 different kinds of soil and says, these are the 4 different kinds of heart. This is an analogy here. And you need to know that of the 4, 3 of them reject it, and it doesn't take root. And so the statistics aren't great on this. And so you'd want to say, Jesus, if you're leading a worldwide revolution here, you should probably redo this. Your marketing plan's not very successful. And Jesus says, you're not the boss of me. And so those 4 soils that he talks about in Matthew chapter 13, the first one is a farmer throws some seed just along the path. And the birds, they came up and they devoured it because there was no deep soil for that seed to fall into. And then some seed had fallen on rocky ground, which did spring up, but because there was no soil underneath it, the sun scorched it and it dried away. And then the third one, the seed fell among thorns. And the seed took root and it started to grow, but the thorns, which are analogous of life, began to choke out the seed and killed it. And he says, but there was one soil, the good soil, where the seed fell. The seed took root, and the seed grew, and it produced a crop. Just for giggles, I know you've heard this parable hundreds of times, but I want to read through with you the explanation that Jesus himself offers on each one of those different soils where the seed falls. And in verse 19, where he's talking about the seed that fell along just the path, and Jesus says, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and they don't understand it, the evil one comes and he snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. And so this is analogous of the person who sits in church for years and listens to sermons over and over and over every week, and it never penetrates their heart. And there's something in them because God has not regenerated their spirit, because God hasn't given them eyes to see. Their heart is hard to it, and it doesn't make any sense, and they have no desire to understand it. And then he goes on to say, but then some of it fell on rocky ground, and this is the one who hears the word, and they immediately receive it. That's the word John uses for becoming a child of God. They immediately receive it. And they not only receive it, but they receive it with joy. Yet, that person has no root in themselves. But they endure for a little while, and then when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, the Logos, which is Jesus, immediately they fall away. That means Jesus sounds really good in the beginning, and I want what they're selling, but I really don't understand the depth of the core message of the gospel. Because so many are fed a gospel message where it's all about you getting all kinds of things from God. And then when tribulation or persecution arises, man, this isn't worth it, and we're out of here. And then some of the seed falls along the thorns. And I don't know this for sure, but from my fleshly perspective, I think this is probably the largest category that most people fall into. The seed falls in, they hear the word, they have on some level received it, they're excited about it, but then notice what Jesus himself says. But the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word. And it proves unfaithful. It doesn't grow. Meaning, from a human perspective, it can look like for just a little while that they've been converted and that Jesus is doing something unique and special in them and that they've changed. But true grace has not changed their heart. Because once they take their eyes off Jesus and they see two things that Jesus says, the cares of this world. Meaning, if you're more concerned about everything that this world has to offer and not about, this is not my Father's world, that is my Father's world, this is his kingdom. May his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Not my will, his will. And so the cares of this world, and then I love the words of the ESV in this, the deceitfulness of riches. Money, money, money. Man, do we bow the knee at that, don't we? For those of you that do stick around, you're going to hear me say a phrase earlier, and it's cheesy. I don't like the phrase, but I believe in it. And the phrase is this: you need to learn, when I say you, me too. As God's children, we need to learn the gift and the discipline of living a generous lifestyle, meaning we need to learn to give our money away. We need to learn that more than the church needs to receive your gift. Because money is a gospel issue. This isn't meant to bring shame and guilt. It's meant to bring an honest look. And it's not just because we're having a financial meeting. I'm going to share great news with you. I share this because God's grace wants it all. He wants all of us. You know what the two greatest tests of the depth of maturity of a person's walk with Jesus? Don't quote me on this. This isn't biblical. I think it is. The two greatest tests of a person's maturity in their journey with Christ. One, let me look at your history browser on your laptop or your computer. Second one, why don't you open up your checkbook transactions and let all of us see? Show us how you spend your money. Because Jesus is saying in this part of the parable that it is possible to receive the good news, but to be so distracted with the riches of this world that they become our idolatry, they become our God, that you are in danger of losing your soul. In the world of chess, that means what? Checkmate. And then, thank God, there's a fourth soil. And there's this fourth soil that falls along the good soil. And this is the one who hears the word and they understand it. And then not only do they understand it, and here's where the proof is in the pudding. Not only do they understand it, but they produce a crop. Meaning God's grace has changed that person so that the outcome, it's different. And for some of us, go with me on this one. If you're heading this way, and when God comes in and we hear the word and we understand it and we produce a crop, some of us make a drastic turn and it looks like this. And we're going at a 90-degree angle. I'm producing a crop, what it says, 100-fold. And that's beautiful. But what's just as beautiful, a little bit more painful, but what's just as beautiful, if you're heading here and God's grace opens your eyes and you receive it, and you believe it and you understand it and it changes you. For some of us, it looks like, I didn't do a 90, but God's not done with me yet. And I'm still, but there's evidence. And so we see here in this parable what it looks like to receive. Can I give you an example of that? I didn't witness this firsthand, but I was privy of it because I know the pastor that experienced this. But he had a man come to him inside his church, and it's a large church. It's one that's in our particular denomination. It's a pastor I love to listen to. And he had a man come to him in his church, and he said this: "You don't know this, but my son recently come out as a homosexual." And I don't know how to respond to that. And so the pastor said, "Well, what have you done?" "I've cut him off. I let him know that I am repulsed with his choice, with his lifestyle, that it is ungodly, that he's going to go to hell, and that I don't want anything to do with him. And the pastor wisely said, how's that sitting with your soul? And he started to weep, and he said, not good. It's tearing me up. I've lost my son. And then he was open enough that he turned to the pastor and he said, tell me what I should do. You tell me what I should do and I'll do it. And the pastor said, really? You sure you want to hear this? Tell me what I need to do. You need to call your son. You need to beg him to have breakfast with you. And then when you see your son, you need to embrace him and hug him. And you need to tell him that you love him. You need to tell your son that there will be nothing in this earth that would ever separate your love from him. He's like, that sound familiar? And the father replied by saying, but I'm repulsed with his lifestyle. He said, do you think your son already knows that? Yes. Then you don't need to tell him again. But my son is going to ruin his life. Do you think your son at some level, he understands that? Yeah, probably. My son may go to hell. He said, you may too. But on that road, if you are a part of Christ, and if he has changed you ever so slightly because you've received him and you understand it and you believe it, if that has happened, then you have no choice but to love your neighbor as yourself. And friend, this is not your neighbor we're talking about. This is your son, your own flesh and blood. Go love him and serve him. You do whatever it takes to maintain a loving relationship with that son. And you allow God to change him. If you've received Christ, you see people differently. It changes how we interact with them. It doesn't mean that we don't say to our new president, what you've done is evil, but I'm going to pray for you and I'm going to love you in the process. And I'm going to beg the Lord, I'm not going to throw this in your face, but I'm going to beg the Lord to bring you to your knees. I'm going to beg the Lord to do whatever it takes to get through to you. All right, that's what it means to receive. Let's quickly close with, what does it mean to believe? What is it that we're believing in? There has to be something concrete that we're believing in. To those who received him, to those who believed in his name, there is a message that there's something. You can't just get it partially right. You know, we scroll through social media, and because I've clicked on a few things about new eating habits, new workouts, that means that I now, because they're manipulating me, I get all kinds of stuff in that any feed, right? And here's what I see. Eat all vegetables and fruits. Don't eat any protein. Eat only protein, don't eat any vegetables and fruits. And you could take every subject in life, because we live in a culture where truth is relative, it's in the eyes of the beholder, and you could take anything and this is what's true for me and true for you. But when it comes to the gospel message, there is no relativeness about this. There is absolute truth that we must believe, that God created the world, and he created it good, and he presented an opportunity to our first parents, Adam and Eve, and they chose evil. And as a result of that, every single human being that has come from them has been born into sin. And some of us, if I could use this unbiblical phrase, some of us are pretty good at not sinning. We're good sinners. And then some are just plain evil. But make no mistake, everyone is worthy of condemnation in hell. A life apart from Christ. And so that's the next thing we believe. That once that fall happened and Adam and Eve recognized their nakedness, God at that moment set in a plan in redemptive history to where he would eventually send his own flesh and blood to live the perfect life that we couldn't, to die on the cross, to accept the punishment that we deserved. And this is what we must believe. Apart from his grace, apart from the atoning work that Jesus did on the cross, we would be lost. And I want to throw something out at you that some of you are going to say, yep, I know what that means. But this is a part of what you believe. If you want to just take it down a few steps deeper, put your snorkel on. You don't have to put a dive tank on this one. A snorkel will do. And it's called this double imputation. And this word imputation, what it means is it's the crediting of something from someone to another person. And this is the essence of the gospel, double imputation. Your sin, my sin, because of the kindness of God, because of his mercy, because of his love, he imputed our sin to Jesus, the one who was holy and perfect. He took our sin away from us and he put it over in Jesus, his son's account. And that defies all logic. Built deep within every one of our DNA is this sense of, no, don't blame me for that. I didn't do that. That one's on you, pal. Or no, that wasn't me. It was Ben. He said it, not me. And Jesus, the one who is perfectly holy and blameless, said, go ahead, put it all in my account. And then here's the double part of the imputation. It didn't just end there. Jesus said, give them my perfect righteousness. And so his perfect record, his spotless, sinless, perfect record was transferred over and credited to your account. So that when the Father looks at us, he doesn't see the mess that we are. He doesn't see the brokenness. He sees that we're covered with his Son. I was telling our discipleship group the other night as we met, I think start this. Start spreading this rumor, would you? I think the best, sweetest words that I can hear that aren't necessarily biblical. They're biblical, but there's no verse that says this. So this is according to Scott chapter 1, verse 1. When you think about Christ giving us his righteousness, it's pictured in the scriptures where he covers us with his righteousness. And so here's Scott chapter 1, verse 1. Jesus looks at you. When we receive him and we believe in his name, Jesus looks at you and says, I've got you covered. I've got you covered. I've paid a meal before for friends standing in Chick-fil-A. They forgot their wallet. Their whole family is there. It was a coach I was working with at Mountain View. Bill come to $37. And he's like, oh no. And his wife says, you idiot, I didn't bring my purse. You said you had your wallet. And they're hanging their head in shame. And in great pride, I was able to step forward and say, dude, I got you covered. I'll pay for it. Here's the difference. I fully expected to be paid back. I did not, out of the kindness of my heart, offer to pay for his meal, thinking he would never pay me back. And forgive me for saying this, but the scumbag never paid me back. And I'm holding that against him. And Jesus says, what I did for you was worth it. I think one of the best analogies that I've heard that I've shared in the past is this. And I'm going to keep sharing this. If you're with me for 20 years, you're going to hear this a dozen more times. It's the person who writes some, either intentionally or unintentionally, and in most cases it's unintentionally. They write some bad checks and something bounces. And then it becomes what do you do in winter in Michigan? Snowball. It starts as this little snowball and it starts rolling down. And what does one bad check beget? Another bad check, and then another bad check. And I'd love to say, raise your hand if you've ever bounced a check before in your life, because that would be me. Surely it was 30 years ago. And that would be us going into the bank and saying to the owner or the president of the bank, I've got all these bad checks that I can't cover. My checkbook is now overdrawn. It's in the negative. And not only do I have all these bad checks I didn't cover, but now I've got all these fines from you. And how sweet it would be. And I experienced this at 17 years old, managing a checkbook, and I had no clue, where the president of the bank said to me in our small little community, Scott, don't cancel your checkbook. Don't close it. Has nobody ever taught you how to balance a checkbook? No. Here's what I'm going to do for you, Scott. It's all done. I'm going to bring your account back to zero. We're going to cover the bad checks that you wrote, and we're going to cancel all of the fines. Your account's back to zero. And I walked out of that bank, thank you, Jesus. But guess what? Still needed diapers, still needed formula, still had no money. And so that part, if we stop there, that's not the gospel. The gospel is that the president of the bank says to us, not only is your transgressions covered and forgiven, but may I remind you that you are an heir with the owner of this bank. All of the resources of this bank are yours. You're not leaving with $0 in your account. You're leaving having the millions of dollars of this bank at your disposal because you are an heir of the owner. And when you receive and you believe in the name of Christ, you become, what's the text tell us in verse 13? A child of God. He gives that right to you. So I've gone over, but let me just end with this question. Have you done that? Do you wake up each morning pushing away and resisting because of the tribulation that's coming, because of the persecution that's coming, because of the cares of this world, because of the riches that entangle us? Or have you said, owner, I'm yours. I receive you. I believe in your name. Do with me what you want. If you haven't done that, or if you need to do that, please come talk to me after the service. I would love to engage you one-on-one. Not in a fist fight. I don't know why I did that. In a gracious, loving conversation. Let me pray.